Hey, welcome to Doctor's Homestead. My name's Daniel, and why? Why plan for the first 72 hours? It's an interesting document. FEMA Nuclear Detonation Response Guidance. It's a 105-page publicly available PDF document, and I'd recommend it. I'd actually highly recommend that you download it. It's free. Take a look at it, skim through it. You may not want to read a whole 105-page document, and we're going to dig into it a little bit. I took some notes here. This obviously isn't 105 pages I'm holding. These are just my notes. I gathered some notes. Wanted to pass on some information. There's a lot of good stuff in here that, depending on the situation, you may not get. You may not get the information in a timely manner when you need it, and it does include things like communication protocols to the public, types of messaging, types of advice they give you. But why plan for the first 72 hours? What's magical about 72 hours? You see the government guidance, and they tell you, have enough food and water for 72 hours, right? Where does that even come from? Why 3 days? And this actually sort of alludes to, explains why 3 days, and I would say why maybe 3 days isn't good enough for you as a person, but you can understand why the government, FEMA, emergency response is saying 72 hours. Be prepared for 72 hours. So that's all here. We're going to dig into it a little bit. So that's it. The purpose of the document, as stated, this nuclear detonation response guidance planning for the first 72 hours delineates missions and tactics that should be executed by first responders, emergency managers, and other state, local, tribe, and territorial response organization during the first minutes, hours, and days following a nuclear detonation in or near their jurisdiction. The document provides guidance on how to protect the lives of first responders and the public, develop a common operating procedure, establish coordinated multi-jurisdictional response, and prepare for the integration of support arriving from other jurisdictions, states, and federal agencies across the country. This guidance is intended to be implemented by the jurisdictions where a detonation occurs, as well as those surrounding jurisdictions that are less affected and will mobilize to provide support. So that's the pretense of the document. I will say the focus really would be, you would call a single strike, right? And that's important when you're talking about why 72 hours. Things like surrounding jurisdictions, right, is the idea of a single strike, and certainly is no way to know what would happen if something happened, but it may not be a single strike. I would add, and something we've spoken about before, when you look at some of Russia's publicly available nuclear response or nuclear attack plans, it's entirely possible an EMP detonation would precede the attack, meaning there would be an EMP and then a nuclear attack. In the event of something like that, you probably wouldn't get any of this guidance when you needed it. So I say it's worth spending a few minutes digging into, give you that guidance now. So why plan for the first 72 hours? If a nuclear detonation happened today, first responder and SLTT organizations, which is state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations, would immediately respond to save lives. However, even with the best of plans, response assets and resources would be overwhelmed due to the scale and complexity of the incident. To maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of their emergency response, planners may need to adjust their approach towards preparing for this level of catastrophe, thereby drastically increasing lives saved, mitigating substantial human suffering, and speeding recovery. This guidance uses the first 72-hour time frame as a notional target to help planners focus their efforts on developing actionable strategies that would have the greatest impact on life-saving efforts, which should be the primary focus during the first few days after nuclear detonation. So we'll keep going. We'll dig in a little bit. So what would things be like? So during the first 72 hours there would be, and we got a list. What would there be? Maximum life-saving opportunity. Many lives can be saved through appropriate public and responder actions during the first 72 hours and days after the detonation. Radiation exposure from any fallout that is produced would be most dangerous in the initial hours and after nuclear detonation. Public and responders who are in areas with substantial fallout would need to take shelter in a building or underground structure where the radioactive material decays reduced to safer levels. Additionally, people with serious injuries from the immediate effects of a nuclear blast would benefit from most from life-saving treatment during this time. So there's sort of two messages there in that, which is, and we've spoken about this before, we did some Surviving Nuclear War series, maybe we'll dig into that again. That's not so much what this is, but radiation when it first is created from the explosion. I know people like to be pedantic about the terms I've used, so I'm going to speak in generalities. Don't need a headache, but the radiation produced right by the explosion, the fallout, does decay quickly over time, but initially the radiation is going to be the most radioactive, right, in terms of exposure, right? It's going to do the most damage, it's going to be the most harmful immediately, and that decays over time. However, people that are injured in the blast, and we'll get into that, need that life-saving care immediately after the blast during the most dangerous time. So it's something to kind of keep in mind there in terms of if it happens and you're expecting the public responders, the first responders, the public to run in and save you, you're sort of on your own. And there's a lot in here where you're sort of on your own, though clearly the plan is to respond and save as many lives as possible. So minimal federal presence. The bulk of federal resources will be en route, many arriving around and after 72 hours. So that's where the 72 hours comes in, is the idea the first 24, 48, first 3 days, you get to 72 hours, you're talking about local and maybe adjacent, right, jurisdictions help. So your fire department, the fire departments nearby in the area, the federal government isn't really going to mobilize and start sending in aid for at least 72 hours, which I believe would tie into why they tell you to have at least 72 hours worth of supplies. I would suggest maybe that's not good enough, right? You might want to consider more, especially if you're new to prepping. There's a lot of assumptions that the rest of that aid will come, and that depends on the level of disaster, right? You see things like FEMA. Single disaster is where this works. If there were multiple disasters or something like that were to happen, you may not get that federal response in 72 hours, right? Decentralized local response to the large affected area and disrupted nature of the incident would disable some components of the impacted jurisdiction's emergency response system and break typical lines of communications. It would be critical for response elements to initially act autonomously and for jurisdictions to quickly reestablish a coordinated response network. This challenge would be most significant during the first 72 hours of the response. So saying nuclear device detonates is going to impact communication. So certainly re-establishing communication would be a priority. So decentralized local response, people would be operating relatively independently. Local first responders would likely be acting relatively independently. So guidance. Now, I think this is important, right? This is important not just for the federal planning, for the FEMA planning, but for your own planning, whether you're a prepper or not. I think this is a key point. Guidance, preparedness for catastrophic incidents such as nuclear detonation requires significant flexibility on the part of the emergency planning and response community. In the post-detonation environment, responders would become overloaded with a sudden urge of incident information, yet have to rapidly make decisions amid conditions of great uncertainty. When planning for such a catastrophic incident, this ambiguity should be accepted and integrated into plans rather than fought against. So I think that's super important, which is to say, any planning, any prepping, we've talked about that before, you need to be flexible, right? It's not one thing that you're prepping for, and we've talked about that. I'm not going to go too deep. Anything you're going to do has to be broad strokes, has to be flexible. You have to be able to adapt, and we've gone into Bruce Lee be water. You have to be able to adapt in any kind of catastrophic incident, any kind of emergency situation. If possible, nuclear detonation response plans should be scenario agnostic, which means you're not planning for a scenario, right? You're planning how to respond to massive disasters, right? Catastrophic incidents, which could certainly occur, have happened throughout history, and not limited by assumptions about yield, height of burst, target, or even the jurisdiction's location in relation to the blast. The last part is important because although many lives will be saved by the jurisdictions located where the detonation occurs, that jurisdiction will require substantial immediate coordinated support from regional partners. So they divide the world into 3 jurisdictions for this, right? You have impacted jurisdictions. This term describes the jurisdictions or areas where the nuclear detonation occurred and encompasses the areas of significant damage and fallout radiation. In this area, response will be urgently needed to support life-saving, shelter-in-place, and evacuation activities. However, the impacted jurisdiction's emergency response infrastructure may be significantly disrupted by the detonation, requiring reconstitution simultaneous to life-saving activities. So if you're in the blast zone, certainly that is the most important. You're already there, right? You can provide the most help, you can do the most activities, but you're likely the most impacted. Next is supported jurisdictions, right? It says during the first 72 hours, resources will primarily arrive from supporting jurisdictions. That's everyone around you that was not impacted. This term describes the regional jurisdictions, states, and areas mostly or fully outside of the blast damage and dangerous radiation zones that have largely intact or quickly recoverable communication utilities and infrastructure such that they can provide assistance to the impacted jurisdictions and receive evacuees over time. So that's everyone around the area of the disaster. And then this is your 72 hours, nationwide support. This term refers to the massive support that will mobilize from states outside the region and the federal government, although the bulk of these resources will not arrive in the first 72 hours. Once again, 72 hours keeps showing up, so why prepare for 72 hours? You're likely to have less help, less support in the first 72 hours until the nation can mobilize to help you, presuming that this is a single incident, right? If it's not, you might be on your own for quite a long time, therefore you might want to personally prepare for more than 72 hours. How to begin planning. Nuclear response planning is daunting, and it is, whether you're an individual or whether you're a government. Based on the expected catastrophic impacts from a nuclear detonation, it's unlikely that a given jurisdiction will be able to execute the operations in its all-hands plan as it is planned and trained for other incident types. And after the detonation, there may be many competing priorities, and that certainly applies as an individual. If you have your own survival plan, right? Whether you have an organization, it's daunting. Where do you even begin? Most people you talk to about surviving, say, a nuclear incident, say it doesn't matter, we're all going to die. You're not, right? That's not how it works. Certainly a lot of people would, and it would be horrible and tragic. But just to give up immediately because it's daunting and just say, well, I'll die. It's no need to prepare there. Well, the government does. The government feels a need to prepare. Missions and tactics overview, guidance structure. The 72-hour, so this is local and regional adjacent, 72-hour nuclear response guidance is organized into 5 missions and 10 tactics. Each mission focuses on a higher priority objective during the first 72 hours of the response. The tactics accompanying annexes provide specific information to achieve the overall mission response objective. So we'll go into them. We'll talk through the 5 missions and 10 tactics. I think it's important to understand the government's plan, the first responders plan, and I think you can learn a lot from this if you have your own survival plan, right? Mission 1, protect responders and the public. Mission provides planners with the resources and direction to develop procedures for disseminating emergency alerts and warnings. So that's really mission 1, is emergency alerts and warnings. And we'll talk a little bit about the emergency alerts and warnings, because it is possible, as I said, depending on the situation, you may not get those. This is the single most impactful mission in this document, since their most lives can be saved during the initial 60 minutes after the detonation if the public reduces their exposure or potential fallout by sheltering inside of the basement or central room of any nearby building. That's number 1, right? Really, number 1 is treat the wounded, right? Treat the wounded. If you're hurt, if you're bleeding out, it may not be good or possible for you to get to shelter, right? So number 1, nuclear detonation. Using a few minutes of time, you can't sit there for hours, but it says first 60 minutes, it takes time. So the nuclear weapon explodes, there's a huge blast, and if you're in the blast, you're in the blast. There's nothing anyone can do for you. That blast doesn't go on forever, but the fallout's going to go quite a long distance. It takes time for the fallout to come up. It takes time for the fallout to come down. Fallout, that's the name. So you do have some time. So certainly treat the wounded and get to shelter. And that's really they're saying. That's going to be the warning they're going to send out if they can, is get to shelter, right? Get to shelter. Many of the activities described in later missions and tactics could occur to some extent without a plan in place, albeit less effectively. However, prompting messaging will not. Tactic 1, immediately issue alert to get inside, direct planners towards pre-scripted messages that can be incorporated directly into SLTT, nuclear detonation response plans, and communication materials. The messages can be quickly disseminated via emergency alert systems, social media, or other communication channels, either warn the public and responders of impending nuclear attack before detonation, or to notify them a nuclear detonation has occurred. In either case, the message is essential the same. Get inside, stay tuned. You may not get the message, right? So looking at this ahead of time, you can start to develop a strategy. You will not have a lot of time if something happens to sit and plan it out, right? You need to be prepared to act decisively, prepared to act quickly. Mission 2, gather information, right? SLTT jurisdiction, systematic coordinated response. We need to attain a common understanding, geographic impacts and hazards, right? So early data collection, right? They need to, once they've alerted the public, they need to know what happened. They need to know what's going on so they can start to build out their plans. So tactic 2, we talked about tactic 1 is disseminate information. Tactic 2, characterize the impact, begins by describing the initial actions first responders should take after a nuclear detonation. Then it provides responders with instructions on what impact information to prioritize and how to collect it safely with the help of EOC, construct a COP. All right. Tactic 3, develop a common operating procedure, instructs EOCs to receive, map, and share this information based on the zone-based response. And we'll talk a little bit about zone-based response. Finally, the mission introduces the pixel picture metaphor that is referenced elsewhere in the guidance. This comparison illustrates how isolated pieces of information from first responders or first responder facilities, the pixels, when aggregated, allow EOCs build a common operating procedure, the picture of the incident to form response decision making. So what they're saying is they're mapping it out, and as they get into later, certainly after nuclear detonation, there's going to be pixels that are gone on the map that they have no information about, but it's the idea of characterizing sectional information, gathering fallout, radiation levels, all the different information from any responders that are able to communicate. Mission 3, organize. Certainly organize the response using information being gathered through tactics 2 and 3. EOCs, incident commanders, and other response leadership can simultaneously begin organizing the response. The mission is essential, where the response begins to transition from initial action to a deliberate, planned, or coordinated response. So zone-based, using zone-based response concept described in Chapter 2 of FEMA's planning. Guidance for response to nuclear detonation. Responders should prioritize incoming resources from the MDZ, this is important, moderate damage zone. Outside of the DZ, the DRZ, dangerous radiation zone. So unfortunately, if you're close to the nuclear explosion, certainly in the first 72 hours, don't expect a lot of help. Certainly you can survive, you can shelter in place. We talked about things like Hiroshima, people that were not very far from the detonation in modest fallout shelters, bunkers. They didn't have fallout shelters, but modest bomb shelters, sorry, air shelters, bomb shelters actually did sort of okay, right? Tactic 4, initiate a zone-based response. And the response card in Annex 2 outlines the life-saving activities that can begin immediately depending on the blast damage, radiation hazards, and continuous conditions in each area. So organize, right, get your pixels, start responding. Certainly there's a lot of people that would be there that want to save lives. Right, that's what they do. They go out, they save lives. Paramedics, any other kind of first responders, firemen. Mission, providing care for survivors, relatively self-explanatory, right? They're going to go out there and provide care for survivors. Mission, prepare for the intermediate phase. So intermediate phase is interesting, and all of this happens in the first 72 hours. So transition to a prolonged response. This tactic highlights the activities that EOCs and the impacted and supporting jurisdictions should execute during the first 72 hours to queue up operations that will be critical to enable further life-saving activities and planning for intermediate and later phase response objectives in days and weeks and months ahead. So that's all within the first 72 hours, but really they're prepping up for that nationwide response. However, there's certain assumptions around a nationwide response. A few tactics here. Immediately issue alert, get inside, right? So after a detonation, the message should instruct everyone, including responders within 50 miles of the detonation, to get inside the nearest building that is not threatened by fire or collapse. Stay there and tune in for more information. This single action may save hundreds or thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives in a large city. Characterize the impact, so they need to understand what happened. It may not be entirely obvious. Was it 1 megaton? Was it 20 megatons? Was it 100 megatons? So they need to characterize the impact, start measuring radiation levels, start gathering information on blast damage, develop their operating procedure. Once again, they pixelate the map, they find the dead spots, they find the good spots. Where can they send help? Where are the hazard zones? Fallout. So let's talk a little bit about fallout. I think it's important to understand fallout. Fallout's what gets you. Fallout is created when the detonation occurs near the surface of the earth. Of course, if the blast doesn't get you. If the detonation occurs significantly high above the ground, e.g. an airburst, there may be limited or very minimal fallout, because fallout is the dust particles that get thrown up in the air and hypercharged. So if it's up in the air, you don't have the giant impact crater, you don't really have the fallout. Immediately after the detonation, the OC should begin aggregating and mapping radiation measures received from responders. Note, quickly identifying areas with measurements greater than 10 RH is extremely important, and that's something they use a lot in here. If you're more than 10 RH, rads an hour, you're in a bad spot, right? So if you have a Geiger counter, I personally do not. Maybe I'll get one. Anything above 10 is really bad, right? 10 rads an hour. Blast damage. So you're going to have blast damage. Blast damage. Reports of blast damage as identified in zone and Tactic 2 should be aggregated and mapped. Information will help responders and leadership prioritize areas for emergency response, critical for identifying zone types, right? So blast damage is going to happen. Fires. Unfortunately, fires will happen, and not because of a nuclear firestorm, but as it says, due to limited firefighting resources and access, fires may expand and combine, blocking passageways and putting responders and people sheltering in place in danger. Given these challenges, firefighting should be balanced with other incident response priorities to make best use of available resources. It's just going to be fires, right? And there won't be people to put them out, is essentially what's saying. Certainly casualties, we can understand casualties, critical infrastructure, likely damage, roads, bridges, tunnels, waterfly, telecommunications, all that kind of stuff. Big explosions do big damage, right? All right, Tactic 4, initiate zone-based response. Once again, they map the zones, they figure out where to send the resources, they start responding. Tactic 5, establish area command, certainly need command and coordination. Tactic 6, sustain critical infrastructure, which is deploy mobile systems, repair existing, or build temporary infrastructure to facilitate ongoing life-saving operations. Let's hit the next one. So evacuate. Evacuate is important to consider, right? That's something you should know ahead of time. You can't wait until you've gotten that communication, if you can even get it. So evacuation, support the mass movement of people along the safest routes away from damaged or hazardous areas and towards supporting jurisdictions, preparing to receive survivors, amplify recommendations, shelter all people in dangerous radiation zone, begin planning a time phase, prioritize evacuation for all blast zones and other areas where it's safe for people to remain. So something interesting they mentioned on the evacuation is if people aren't listening, they're not sheltering, and they're just taking off running, it sort of says you've got to just let them go, right? They're panicked, they're scared. Trying to stop people from evacuating too early, from leaving their shelters, is not going to be productive. So keep that in mind. You stay in your shelter for as long as you can. 1 week, I would go more than 72 hours. Really depends on the radiation levels. But if you just panic and you take off running, they're sort of going to let you do that. It's just not worth the effort to not. So triage, stabilize, and transport. Certainly going to be a lot of injured people. We want them to do that. Decontaminate. So this is something you can know ahead of time. You don't need them to tell you decontamination protocols. So guidance summary: promote and support rapid, dry, self-decontamination methods such as changing or shaking outer layer of clothes, wiping exposed surfaces in the impact jurisdiction, minimize use of limited resources on population monitoring technical decontamination. So here's a checklist for decontamination. Tactic 9. Prioritize dry, rapid decontamination techniques. Population monitoring is not an early priority, especially in the impacted jurisdictions. Provide public messaging that instructs people to perform self-decontamination. Provide replacement clothing for potentially contaminated evacuees arriving. Supporting jurisdictions. Support ad hoc sites with screening and decontamination capabilities. So leverage early dry self-decontamination tactics. So you wouldn't want to spray yourself with water, because once you're wet, you're going to be sticky, right? So you might have more contaminated particles sitting on you unless you're in a clear zone. So dry self-decontamination. Early fallout is primarily composed of short half-life isotopes that rapidly decay in the first day, such that the early self-decontamination is far more effective at reducing radiation exposure than a delayed thorough washdown with water. Dry, since fallout is likely to be particles the size of table salt or filter sand, dry decontamination techniques are very effective at reducing levels of contamination, thus exposure. Dry decontamination methods do not involve the use of liquid water to remove contamination. Instead, they include removing outer clothing and using a brush, adhesive tape press, moist towelettes to remove contamination. Perform self-decontamination by changing clothes, especially the outer layer. Contaminated material can easily be caught in the collar of shirts, tops of shoes around the ankles or similar locations. Place potentially contaminated clothes in a plastic bag or other sealable container and away from people. Shower if running water is available. If not, use moist wipes, paying particular attention to face, hands, and hair. If washing your hair, do not use conditioner. Decontaminated medical equipment, vehicles, wheelchairs, eyeglasses, service animals, pets. Vehicles and other important items by wiping, brushing, or if available, rinsing with water. Continue to follow shelter and evacuation recommendations. Do not delay self-decontamination. Tactic 10 is transition to prolonged response. Once again, that's the idea. You've made it through 72 hours. And the nation is coming together, right? All these external resources are coming in. They're going to start supporting, bringing in first responders. All right, camera just overheated. We're out here in the sun, so I think it cut off maybe around transition to prolonged response, guidance summary. And the idea, once again, is 72 hours after that, you're going to receive support from outside of the area, right? Whether it's National Guard, Red Cross, any of those agencies, they're going to start pouring in and helping you out. Once again, that presumes a single incident or limited number of incidents, and that type of support would be available. I think as an individual planning to say 72 hours is a little presumptuous. I think you're going to catch yourself unprepared. So I want to get into this before the battery dies. Phone overheats again. Immediate post-detonation first responders checklist. All responders go inside a thick-walled building, underground basement immediately. Move if shelter threatened by fire or collapse. Responders without radiation detection equipment shelter inside for up to 24 hours, and until informed it is safe to respond. Responders with radiation detection equipment assess radiation rate outside. If radiation levels are greater than 10 RH, stay inside and sheltered from fallout. Only conduct a quick critical life-saving outside. When outside radiation levels are less than 10 RH, conduct life-saving activities outside. Monitor total dose for each responder or use group dosimetry. All right, second time phone camera overheated. I'm just outside in the Texas summer, so I'm gonna call it there. I think I got everything I wanted to cover. As always, thank you for watching, and we appreciate you.